Oh, so okay. Yeah, it's working. Yeah, what I want to do is like this. I have a whole Zman over here. And what I want to do has basically two parts. I want to have more coffee. Okay. I want to do proofs for existence of God. Mit der Deilige, Rabbi Saini Rishonim. The Rishonim haben gesagt that it's an important thing. That's the material. The Zach, Choymer, was gewillt in. I was trying to do at least, figure out a way to do it. But the way to do it is like this. I have a few conditions for this to work. What are my conditions? And maybe those conditions are more important than the actual proving and so on. The condition is that there has to have, from two sides, from the top and from the bottom, it needs to be doing more than proving that there is a God or something like that. And why? Because we run into two problems whenever I try to do this, whenever Hunter gets out, people try to do this, right? We already discussed that one mode of doing this is just like opvregen Richard Dawkins and the Cat Delay. That's a totally boring thing to do because it's not hard to frag them up and it's not hard to play this game forever. And it doesn't really seem to help. Kann sagen, auf Yiddish, what man gesagt, it doesn't give anyone Yiddish Shemaim. Right? It doesn't look like, to me, now maybe I'm wrong, but to me, the people that are very good at fragging up Richard Dawkins don't seem to be more religious in any pneumistic sense. Or more, again, like they don't seem to have a better conception of God or a better way to work with conception of God than anyone else. They're just debaters or whatever, apologists and so on. And it might be useful for social political reasons. There might even, it's good. There's like even people no. Beside it, no, but I'm not interested in that. If you read Rambam, if you read Choslavovus, maybe not Rav Sadegun sometimes pretends to be only apologist. But if you read Rambam at least, and if you read Rav Sadegun, if you read basically everyone else, including all the Mekabulim basically, and everyone that's interested in theology as a kind of Avodas Hashem, as a kind of actually ultimate goal of a human being, they all have, it seems from all of them, that from reading this, from understanding this, from getting to this, they literally see this as the goal of all knowledge, of all science, of all wisdom, right? There's this whole ladder of wisdom that we arshin sort of from the Arab philosophers. We know it starts with logic and it ends with theology. Basically, in the middle, there's science and astronomy and math and all these things. And that's also a ladder of, like we could read the end of Moed Nevuchim, and that's also the ladder of Avodas Hashem. And in other words, it's also the ethical ladder, right? It's also the ladder that answers the question: what is a human for? What are people for? What are people's answers that question. Now, you would expect, if that seems to be true, and you get the feeling from reading these people, again, not all of them, there's probably some differences to be made we don't want to get into, but like, the Sefer Rishonim has one goal, and there's people have different goals by doing all these things. But at least if you read, again, let's assume the Choslavovus and the Rambam, the impression that you get, and not only impression, it's mefirish, especially in the Rambam, it's very mefirish, although the Rambam himself does have the story of the stira between Sayachel and Amin and figuring out. But in the end of the day, it's very mefirish in the Rambam that this knowledge, this maybe we could call it more of like the act, this learning of this noise, is going to change your life. It's going to give you a reason to live, basically, because this is actually what humans were born for, right? And then. And nowadays, like I was saying, from the most simple sense, it doesn't seem like, so I wanted to say from the top and from the bottom. From the top, the Rambam at least thinks that this proofs, and not only proof, but the proofs are part of this. The conception of God that he wants to teach you, right, has positive value in it. Of course, people get stuck with this whole negative theology thing, where he seems to say that it's whatever we say about God is only in shlilistic way and so on. But of course, that's definitely not true in the human aspect of it, right? And the Rambam himself has a whole hezbollah of if it's true that we only know Yidiyas Hashlila, then how is a smart person better than a dumb person? And he has a teretz for this kasha, right? Whatever the technical lumdus would be over there, it's obvious that this whole project of doing theology, this whole project of learning about God, has as its aim to make you, to give you a better understanding of God. Now, how we describe this understanding, if nobody really understands God in the end, I get the shal, but that's a technical question. But you need to at least see this person and say, this guy looks like he has, it's like you take any sigi, right? If you learn a sigi bein, if you learn some Masechta or some Noise, and there's people that have spent the 10 years or whatever that it takes to learn to understand Kachim, and when he talks about a carbon, he seems to know what he's talking about. That seems to makes more sense to him. And following from that, the saying the person that does theology all this time, b'l'chayre, nish l'chayre. If you read the Rishonim, we see it's 100% like this. When he davens, or when he maybe it's not like b'chitzoni, but in his avodas Hashem has a totally different, like the difference to someone that could say Ketzah Shech and someone that could say Tosfos and the Rambam. That's that level of difference, and I don't see this happening. At least for all the apologists that I know, I don't see anything like this happening. It might be happening now. This is the interesting thing. It might be happening to people that learn things in a very dogmatic way, like people that learn Chabad Chassidus, and it's assumed that everything that it says there is true. But somehow from that they have a more, we could call it a positive aliyah, positive. They learn something positive, something that has content. Somehow when davened, somehow from his askula, what they call Chabad askula, from his askula, he got some sort of conception of God, that they call it likis, whatever, that helps him, that changed his yachas to God. This changes avodas Hashem, it changes his understanding. There's some better understanding, and nothing like this seems to happen to people that are in the proof business. So that's the first. This is kind of like the top aspect of what I'm saying. So you need to have, it needs to give you an understanding, and I think that there's technical reasons for why this happens. I have to get into a lot of detail.
Because it seems like Rambam's time
exactly
was kind of
right. So what's the difference? So what's the geschehen? I think, and I'm trying to figure this out. I think that there's a lot of technical reasons and internal to philosophy, internal to the way that the proofs are understood, reasons for why this happens, and why we could talk, I think, why things like Chabad, which probably the only people that are still doing something close to this, does work in some sense at least. Maybe not. Maybe they also have some. That's one we could call it like a research question, right? One question is what taka happened, and what do we have to change? What do we have to have for that? I'm gonna say a few things. The second thing, maybe it's the same thing. The second thing is the bottom half of this, right? And then I'll have a middle. The bottom half of this would be that in the Rambam's version, in the whole, what we could call like the whole major medieval synthesis of science. And when it starts from, it's like it has 1,000-year history, the story more or less. They all assume that this is good for Yiras Shamayim. Of course, there might be some people that say the opposite, that it's bad for Yiras Shamayim, and on very different social contexts. And this is not something that Rambam seems to be bothered by, right? Again, so we get this is, and at least in the end of medieval, interestingly, in the end of the Middle Ages, more or less, we start seeing people saying that everyone that's a philosopher becomes a shtickle overgeklärt, a shtickle maskel, a shtickle halbegoy.
Does say that people before they know.
Yes.
Be very careful because
the Rambam Zagdom and his
like the honey, like whatever, the mushroom and the honey.
In the Lamed, but okay. Yeah, okay. That might be a beginning of a solution for what's missing. That's one thing that we could think of that for what's missing. If we ask this question, why to them? But right now, nothing. That's why I'm thinking on the top and the bottom. The top would be the understanding, and this is something. What I said first was actually the bottom, or closer to the bottom, right? And the Rambam, having these proofs, having this knowledge, and having all these understanding, it gives you a better understanding. Against Besem Mazbazan, I sort of jumped too quickly to the like Avodah Hashem in my presentation, but it actually gives you there's something positive to be understood. There's something that takes, we could just say it in the sense of time, right? It takes you 10 years to get to this level of understanding that he wants to get to, and that itself is like an intellectual as madrag, it's intellectual accomplishment that you accomplished. I have understood God. I went to school. I went to the Rambam school I went through the whole program, and then now I understand God. And this is also not, so this is probably the first thing. This is also not what the contemporary apologists are doing. Their maskuna is, therefore, Mr. Dawkins is wrong. Okay, beside that. But they're not giving you an understanding of God. They're giving you a proof that God exists. If you want, you could call this the difference between Metzias and Mehis, or essence and existence, right? But it's not really. Probably doesn't map correctly to how those concepts work. But you could say like they just proving that something like a God exists, but they don't really have a good. You could read. Miki Abraham is going to always be my most close example for someone that totally does this very openly, where he says, "I'm going to prove you that there is God, but I have nothing to tell you about this God." Right? Well, the only thing I would say is if I'm using cosmological proof, so it's the first cause or things like that. But it doesn't really have any. You feel like he doesn't know anything about his God, and in the Rambam, it's definitely not like this. Even when he
does, like, cause like he says that probably if you create a world, so probably he has something, he wants something.
So wait, that's
so
but that's his.
Then you have,
I'm not worried about this, but I understand. I'm not worried about this part, but let's see. This is what I want to also talk about. I'm not worried about this part so much, right? He's firstly at that stage he starts to just make stuff up, right?
Right.
Probably in Efshes, because it makes it a little more mistaber. That's very schwach. The Rambam doesn't have this schwachkeit, and there's a reason. There's a secondary reason for this, but. Even in the concept of Elikis itself, let's not talk about the rest of the Torah. Let's talk about the mitzvahs and minhag, right? Because I want to bracket, I want to put away the problem of, and therefore you have to put on the tefillin. Forget about the tefillin. In the Oisek and Hilchis mitzvahs and minhag, forget about them. Let us do. I'm mitzvah. It's also a mitzvah. Why do I have to worry how that's mechayev a different mitzvah? This is the one mitzvah by itself, right? To him, he doesn't know anything about the nature, about the essence of God. And of course, this is the reason why David Shem doesn't change. By doing all this arichas proofs, and you could this actually very easily so technically in the proofs, because if you read the Rambam's proof, and not only the Rambam's proof, all the Rishonim proof, and Thomas Aquinas's proof and so on, they all have a next step, which is proving what God is, and half of the Rambam, like if you read his book, the other way from the beginning, it's mostly about proving what kind of God exists, not that there exists a God, right? He's not really worried about atheists, even so much he's not more worried about people with the wrong idea of God, right? And his proofs, and very explicitly, the Rambam is very much in the search of a proof that not only proves that there is a God, but that the God is one and is mifshet and is whatever his list of essential attributes come out to be, that exists, right? And the people, at least people like, and this is something very important, and this is probably one technical reason why they don't gain any understanding, but there's another reason. The first reason is this, that they're not even worried. They feel like why is it important to do theology, which is understanding what God is? It's important to not be an atheist, but once we have a God, then we sort of jump right into putting on film, or if you're a Christian, into whatever, and shine. And of course, then it's sort of useless. It's useful for damash or whatever, but it's not useful in the internal sense. Not useful for becoming a better. A religious person or having a better knowledge of God. They don't actually get any knowledge of God from doing any of that. Now, once I'm thinking about this is really the first thing, and now once I'm thinking about this, I would need to realize that there's a very important reason for this, and you have to get into more technical things besides for this. But the first thing I would say is the impression that I get is that they're defending a very minimalistic version of God exists, and they become focused only on we could call the form of the proof or the form of the question, not on the content of it. Not form like the Aristotelian form, but the form in the sense of does this proof work that there is a thing called God and so on, but it sort of misses, and this is what happens whenever you do logic proper, right? Logic is only about forms of arguments, it's not about the content or the essence of those arguments, right? Does it follow from these premises and so on? And what happens from this is something very weird, I think, and this some people are tanning this in other contexts. What happens is something very weird, that they turn out to be a very primitive idea of God. in some sense, even the Namali, the Pushti, that sort of believes what the Rambam says, and the Gomekrim and so on, has this God that's is less defined, is less clearly defined. So therefore, it's harder to like pin him down with all kinds of proofs and so on. But it's a lot more sophisticated, has a lot more nuance in it. It's sort of like the difference between proving that a person exists and meaning the person, where you have a lot of detail, we could say, a lot of concepts about it, a lot of flesh. It's very fleshy. It's very has a lot of meat in it. It has a lot of what other word would I use? Thick. It's not a thin, minimalistic concept. Which is barely a concept even. Like, right? It's barely even he barely even knows what you're talking about. And this seems to have to do with a lot of philosophical assumptions about how the world works, and about essentialism, and about the opposite of essentialism, which would be nominalism, where you only talk about language and you end up talking about yourself instead of talking about anything. That might be the philosophical reason for why we end up here. But Bekitza, that's the... So to recap, we have two different problems, right? One is that for the Handlige people, they end up with an idea that is totally uninteresting. Another way of proving that it's uninteresting, that no person that's not a philosopher cares, or that's not a guy on the internet debating if God exists. Right? If you go on with Medrash, I'm giving you a sheet, explain you in detail the cosmological proof, it's not even interesting to anyone. Versus if you tell them, I'm going to explain the 10 spheres, even something like that, which might have a lot less meaning in some sense, but at least I'm going to have I'm telling you something to a normal person, and not only to a normal person, it's actually true, I think, and I'm not telling you anything. I'm giving you a whole long math beside it. It's not about anything, really, because I'm not helping you refine your concept of God and helping you, and therefore, these kind of logical arguments that people that we know do, and are more or less don't teach us anything, even in the philosophical sense. They might help us, like saying the game. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it doesn't, which is relevant to this, like a point in this, is that therefore, and they seem to be uninterested at all in proving what people once used to call God's essential attributes, right? And that seems to be very weird. Why is he not interested in that? Why don't they care if there's one or two gods? Because he cares about uppfragging an atheist. Okay, but why don't you care what kind of thing God is? And that's maybe because he has a different goal, which is uppfragging the atheist, and not the goal of understanding Göttlichkeit. But he totally, and his proofs don't even try to get to that, which is something that the Rambam's proof and everyone else's proof 100% try to get. That's the second point. Third point is what I call the totally bottom thing, is which seems to be connected to this, is that therefore that this seems to change nothing. Regarding what we could call Avodas Hashem. Seems to be useless to devotion, basically. And this is something that is 100% untrue in the Rambam, right? The Rambam definitely thinks that this will give you more Yiras Shamayim. Of course, like you say, maybe there's to get to the risks, but in the end, if it works, it's supposed to give you Yiras Shamayim. It's supposed to give Yiras Ramas, Yiras Ahavas Hashem, whatever. Like even the Chabad, they keep on assuming this, right? I don't know how much of they do it, but you understand the Gadlus Hashem. This is what it means, Lisboinim beGadlus Hashem, right? And it seems like most of these people, most people have no idea what that even is supposed to mean. What is Gadlus Hashem? How is it? What does it mean? What is it to do with this? Like one of the ways people would ask, okay, there is a God, okay. How many minutes does it take to think about this, right? And we end up with a very interesting question, which is a very important question, even in the Rambam. What does it mean to spend time to go into the, like I say, you'll think for an hour, okay, let's say. Be'inyan Gadlus Hashem, what are you going to do for that hour? This is a question that I get a lot. Chazal says that the Ikra Avodas, to think about God. Okay, what do you do in that thinking? What is it to think about?
The Rambam, when it comes to that, he says he doesn't talk about his proofs. He talks about more the. And
then that's a very important diak and parik and whatever. And yeah, it's not only halfway is true. So here we end up with sort of two thoughts. I could say what I know about this, but I think that there's something missing in this whole presentation because of us not getting the whole thing of how these proofs work and everything. we can end up with a sort of totally devotional pshat, which says that, okay, thinking about God basically means, like, like Chassidim would say, not Chassidei Chabad, but other Chassidim. See, Chassidei Chabad are totally on the rational side of this, what Avram Kaliske would say, whereas thinking about God basically means what we could call like meditation, in the sense of focusing on God to the exclusion of other things. So it's just another way of saying focusing. It's not really thinking, it's focusing. Or rikuz, right? Rikuz. What the Buddhists have words for these, better terms for these kind of things. I forgot what it is, right? Just usually you think about a lot of random things. So think about God. Now, does that have to have content? So we could do some meditation course to explain you that you don't really need discursive content for that, though. That's one understanding. The problem with this, according to the Rambam, the problem theoretically, what he seems to say is that the problem with this is that you might end up worshipping the wrong God with that rikuz, and that therefore you have to first know who the God is. That seems to be what he says in that Paidik. It's obviously not everything that can be said about this, because it doesn't seem to be correct. It's we have to. This really requires what figuring out this answer requires. And again, this is the research question. Requires is having a better theory of what it means to know things, what it means to think of things, what it means to understand things. Right? That it doesn't really happen in time. That doesn't really happen in time. It doesn't mean I'm going to spend 15 minutes on it. It means that I gained an understanding, which is a certain sense that this is important for getting to anything which we want to get into in this subject in the eyes of the Rambam. It's important in that he thinks, because we get to how he thinks literally about Olam Haba, right? About Ashuras HaNefesh, which to him is sort of the eternal existence of the mind, understanding things, and this sort of and you understand what I'm saying? And if you have this, I'm just making like a map of things to figure out. And maybe this is something that we could have like a whole thing about by itself, and maybe have to practice to get what it means, right? Because just to get back where I am, right? I was trying to think about. We're trying to think about here why devotion, right? How this changes devotion, and how it actually changes not only. Again, so one simplest way to say it would be to say, okay, devotion is a thing. It's an action, basically, right? It's an action that happens. We could say it happens in a body. And like another way of saying it happens in a certain time, right? For this 10 minutes, I will focus only on God. And then how do you do that? So of course, someone will say, well, it seems like meditation techniques are much more useful to this than Moira Nevarchim. Man, obviously they are. That's what they're about. What are meditation techniques? And Baal Shem Tov can give you a pshat with how everyone has different techniques about this, but there's a lot of techniques. And Chassidish Svurim have techniques for this, and Sufist literature has techniques for this, and Rambam has techniques for this, and everyone has techniques for how to focus. What do you do if you have distractions? Things like this. But that's all things that happen in time, very much, right? In space, in time, and you could say, okay, and for this, it's important to have the Akdumah of having the right dogma, because you don't end up by mistake doing Avodah Zarah, which is, by the way, a very weak justification for what would be wrong with that. Like, what would be so wrong with having the wrong pshat of God when you're mispoed? It's inshallah. Of course. But that's not enough. That's what the Rambam would say in the literal reading, but it's obviously not enough. I find it very weak justification. The second question, what I think is really important and to realize over here is that it's not something that happens in time. Because for this we need to really unravel the Rambams, in other words, the old-fashioned theory of knowledge, the old-fashioned theory of what knowing means, what understanding means, and the sense and the way in which knowing really means what we call the actus of Seichel, Maskell, and Miskel, right? Or it really means having the thing that you know, in a real sense, not in a theoretical sense, not in a representational sense, in a real sense, right? In other words, in the sense of Dvaikus, in the sense of becoming one with God or with the object of knowledge that God gives us, however exactly you define this theologically, and in the sense in which this is something which Moed Nevuchim actually helps, you understand? In other words, this is not something that happens in time. It happens by acquiring, we call this literally Seichel Nikna, right? By acquiring the correct knowledge. In other words, because otherwise there's no knowledge. It's not about remembering the whole time God, like not focusing on God. It's about acquiring then the concept of God, which is literally acquiring what we can call an neshama in the Rambam sense, and then you have it forever. Now you might be able to forget it. We can get into the question of how, in what sense it still exists in time, because we still have a body. We are embodied things that exist in time, in the sense of us being bodies. But in the sense of not being bodies, then it's not even something that you could forget. The Rambam literally says this sometimes. This thesis about this, and people are worried about this, but it's obviously this is the difference, that this is not something that exists in time. It's like the most way for us to understand it generally is like, okay, now if you understood a concept, usually very hard to forget it, right? We forget pruta, right? But it makes sense for someone, maybe if you have literally Alzheimer's and so on. But normal, nobody chazer is what's the chilik between what was my father's simon and a siva, right? You have to chazer that. It's not something that you forget. Why? Because this becomes your a very basic, it's like aleph bais, becomes your basic concept of the world. And having a concept of God like that would mean that you have that's a transformation. That literally is like a different person than the person that doesn't have that concept. And this is again to answer something that's very weird to most people nowadays when you tell them, the Rambam's theory of Olam Haba is basically that your knowledge of God exists forever. People look at this like, oh, such a letdown. I thought it was going to be more fun. And the Rambam, it's not at all like this, you see? This is something that's like a taham between this Rambam's original way of, I'm not even talking about the content this year, we have to get that. I think there's a difference in content also, but at least the connotation, the attitude that he seems to have to these ideas is totally not the attitude that we read it. Both the Frima people that are against the Rambam for that and the academic people that are like, okay, that makes sense, because that's at least rational somehow. Both of them seem to have the totally wrong mood for this. Because the Rambam's mood is that this is actually a better element. It's amazing. It's basically the mood that you get from Mikabulim, which basically say the same thing in more cool language. But it's that his mood is like, wow, it's amazing. You are going to, I really get it. It's plausible, at least we could say it's plausible in his theory of knowledge and his understanding of what it means, what the end of human being is, what ethics are, right? And of how the concepts of philosophy works. It's totally plausible. It's not mashiga. When he says, and this is Olam Haba, that's something plausible to him. Not only plausible because Nebuch, he gleibt Aristo and the Torah, so he has to find up the doichik teretz. He doesn't see it as doichik at all. Forget about the pashal of how to fetch it around the chimish. That's a small question. The bigger question is that to us this seems like you just killed the whole idea. Like some people will ask, like people literally ask this, and people start asking this in the end of the Middle Ages. People start asking this question. This is why our Babas were Yidden because of this. That sounds very weak. That's what people say, and the Rambam will tell you what do you mean. Now you understand why we're Yidden. It's just the opposite. To him, this makes the most sense. It actually it's beautiful. It's plausible. It's misyashiv al lev. It's miskabel al adas that this should be. Is it everything? Does it stem with every Rambam Chazal? These are all prutim that we could think about. But he doesn't have this fremdkeit with it. He doesn't have this deflation. He just deflated the whole religion. He just turned religion into something totally boring and uninteresting. Like why would everyone? People ask this. So basically, Olam Haba is knowing a lot of science. I'm like, okay, why do you think that that's a bad thing? Why is that less than what you thought Olam Haba was? And I could ask this even in the modern concept, but there's definitely a totally different. All these words mean something very different in the old way of thinking, in their way of thinking, and in which it made total sense. All these things, and I think this is to go back to the middle thing. So that's the bottom thing, like why this seems to. It's not inspiring, right? Nobody says, "I will inspire you by teaching you the Rambam's theory of Olam Haba," and to the Rambam it's supposed to be inspiring. Definitely for people that actually understand it. Of course, the Rambam would. We can get to that. But it's supposed to be in the end, in the true understanding of it, it's more inspiring. This is the people that actually understand it are the ones that go al Kiddush Hashem, and they're the ones faket. The other ones, bedoichik, maybe have much schwachere Yerushalayim, have much schwachere connection to anything. So that's really the question, right? Sort of. So these are my top and bottom differences, top and bottom questions. Then there's sort of like a middle thing, which maybe is the teretz, or maybe a beginning of a teretz. Maybe a place where to look for the teretz. And this also a lot of people know about, so I'm just putting it out there as a third step in my plan, which is that the Rambam and all of his friends are working within a certain, what we call Aristotelianism, in a certain theory of the world, a certain metaphysics, a certain physics, a certain science, which we as people usually say, we do not accept anymore. nobody, and I never heard any of those people justifying why they don't accept it. But that's what they say. The card that's not. I not schon gefragt. Okay, could we go through the arguments one by one and figure out, like, just bekitze, you know what? Just tell me bekitze how it was so gefragt.
Well, you believe that
Wait, that one? Okay. By the way, how did you freak that up? How exactly?
I don't know.
You don't know, right? You're just assuming. Of course. Why? Maybe it's true.
I don't know. Some people.
No, by the way, this is a pretty good example because I don't know if it's a plausible theory still, but I'm pretty sure that what the Rambam meant.
Could do what pop out. What do you mean?
Therefore.
But
That's a kasha?
That's against the Aristotelian view, and the whole Greek thing was that they're stationed.
Not exactly true. Nachamol, there's details that, of course. Okay, let me just to get to this, right? I don't want to get stuck in this prat, but I just want to use this as an example. Nachamol. That's a good. You could always say you can ask that about everything, but this, like Pashtus, everything they said was wrong. I don't know where the Pashtus came from, and when you try to look it up, you don't actually find some easy terms. Of course, there's some details that are wrong. No, nobody argues with this. So, but for example, let me give you an example. Yaakov Kamenetsky, he goes, looks at the moon landing, right? And he says, now we finally know that obviously the moon doesn't have an neshama, like the Rambam said. And I'm thinking about this before. What? You want to explain me how this proves that? I have no idea how it proves it. Because people obviously are like, it's a rock. The Rambam didn't think that the moon was a rock. Maybe he happened to not have thought that. Okay, so let's say if he said that the moon is not a rock, it's made of some different kind of matter. Okay, wait, that's true. That's ungefragt. It's not made of different kind of matter. But this thought that it moves because it has some kind of neshama in it. Was that ungefragt? How was that ungefragt? What's the got to do with the moon landing?
No, but Akin's radar.
I'm in it.
If once you have the theory of relativity,
that's I'm in it.
Was
kommt daran? I'm in it. Bald am umkommen zu der Razor, because not upfragen the Razor. Nobody proved that either, by the way. But the kind of no, but let's not get to that. I'm just saying that there's a lot of shtissim in this kind of debates, because the question. So you could say, right, maybe Newton's law of gravity, of relativity, maybe gravity as an explanation for other planets is a better explanation than that they move because they have an neshama or something like that. Maybe. And they also have to know what exact definition of a neshama. Maybe it's no shaykhs. Maybe it's talking a different level of things. But let's say, going on the moon definitely doesn't disprove anything. No shaykhs. Stop no shaykhs. No shaykhs. Like, ich kann trap shaykhs in der Schale. Es stimmt auf beide shit, es stimmt es.
Okay.
It might flag up some random prutim and some things, but no shaykhs. It's just a mistake. Like the most basic mistake.
Okay.
It's like, it's as big a mistake as the guy that came and said, I was by an autopsy and I saw there's no neshama. And once I was by some roof and this kid came and asked this question. He said, yeah, because the guy... True story. And by the way, it's not a joke. I'm not getting... that was his tenet. By the way, it's a bad tenet, but I'm not getting into this. Of course he doesn't see neshama. I mean, if you caught up a live person, but even see neshama, right? That's not going to answer the kash. But besides that, I'm just saying, you're thinking about the wrong... It's like no shaykh. It's not even a good kasha, right? Even for atheists, it's not a good kasha. There's probably better kashas against the neshama than this, right? Sure. But let's get back to this. Let's get back to where I am. We keep on this. People say, and it's said that the Rambam's entire let's say, these proofs of existence of God, for example, are based on the Aristotelian physics and metaphysics, right? And therefore, there's different things that you could say. Therefore, you see, I feel like the therefore makes a very big difference to what we should do with this, right? Because what actually seems to have happened, the people say, therefore we're going to we're going to take all the negativity of the Rambam without any of his positivity. What I mean by negativity, we're going to agree, because this seems to be a very standard modern theology, not only in people that call themselves modern, and almost in a lot of Yiddishkeit seems to have done this. And they say something like this: okay, the Rambam told us that God cannot be spoken about in any logical way because of his whole fancy theory of whatever ta'arim and attributes and all of that. But you see, for the Rambam there was a huge amount of positivity in this, right? What's the positivity? Because this is connected to his entire understanding of the universe. It's not, even if you do take some minimalistic pshat and say, but to the Rambam understanding God basically means understanding physics, right? Understanding nature. Physics is just another word for nature. Because that's Maaseh Hashem, and that's really understanding. It gives us an idea of godless Hashem, right? And then we say, wait, but this doesn't work. People actually say this all the time. The Rambam said that Masa B'Raishis is physics. And it's obviously false because his physics was false. What? Exactly, explain me this argument again. How exactly does this proof say anything? It could still be true. Maybe we'd have to say switch out Shamprutim, okay. But why, and the same thing for Masa Merkava with metaphysics and so on. What is wrong with this pshat? That you disagree with some detail beside it? Well, it was shaykhs. But again, it's like, but what is the way this works is sort of that you left with this skeleton of the Rambam, the skeleton of the medieval theology, which says that God cannot be spoken about, cannot be understood, and so on.
What does that have to do with that?
Okay, because what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to say something like this, and tell you what I mean. In another way, in a extremely old-fashioned way, right? We're talking about old-fashioned already. In a really old-fashioned way, in other words, in like in a pshita shal mikra way, or in a. I'm saying it like this, but maybe I'm not only mean to think like this. But let's try to say it like this. In a very old-fashioned way, in a pshita shal mikra, pshita shal chazal way, whatever, pshita shal medrash way, agudis hamashapshis hasadayis way, God is totally knowable. Totally exciting, right? He has big hands and big feet, and when he walks, the earth trembles, and when he spits, the ocean just earthquakes, right? When he cries, there's a tsunami, and so on, right? And he puts on tefillin every day, and gewaldig, right? That's there's some content in that, right? That's a God that you could actually know, that you could actually speak about. Now we're not worried about the philosophy and everything about it, but it's totally rich. There's a very rich concept. It's not poor, right? Is it provable? It's probably provable too. By Nissim, he spoke to me last night, whatever. Totally provable. Again, not in like some philosophical concept, but it's very alive and very provable. Now comes some Rambam. And another way, is it devotionable? Is it something that you could worship? Of course, right? That's what it's about, right? Now comes the Rambam and people like him, and they say, well, this pshat is all, at least the literal meaning of this is all nonsense and silly, and shouldn't think about God like this. But they retain the entire aliveness of it, and they probably make it even more alive, because they say, and God is so great, and this you could read the Chavos Halvos, you really get this impression, and some Sufis you get this impression. God is so great, he's not even a body. He's even bigger than, the Rambam literally uses this language. God is even greater, more perfect than what you think he has a big kisakovet. Kisakovet, a kleinigkeit. He's totally, literally beyond all the Galgan. Right.
Gashmi is the bigger.
Right. He has this whole thing. Right. But so what we're left with, not only we're left with, actually amplified the positive knowledge of God here. Now, of course, what does it actually mean to understand something that's not a gift? Besides the additional details, we could figure out. Maybe there's something, but it actually has a huge value. There's actually something to do here. There's something to do with, and there's something to know, and there's something to do. Right? Now, of course, this to do has the actual understanding of it, not just saying God is not. Actually understanding it comes with the entire baggage, so to speak, of Aristotelian metaphysics, at least, and probably also physics. We discussed this in our previous series. We basically did this and tried to show why. One of the things I said was why Eine Gif basically only makes sense in Aristotelian physics. The definition of it means that it's not a body, which is, I think, that physics is based on, and so on. Or the same, we talked about change and all these different concepts. God doesn't change, which means because everything is changed, and God doesn't change, right? But now, if you have this view of the world, then that's something to know. There's something going. It's an amazing thing. There's something. Now, if you don't have this view, right, you say, wait, all these concepts, which is something that I said, right? All these concepts makes no sense to us, because, again, b'minah pshita, we believe that the Achronim fraked up everything that Aristotle ever said, and Kant or whatever, b'minah pshita, and therefore all these concepts makes no sense. Bodies and potentiality and actuality means nothing, and body and not body means nothing, and change and unchanged means nothing, because these not concepts that we relate to. They're not categories in which we analyze the world at all. They're not real to us. And knowledge is not real to us even. But that's another whole thing, right? Same thing, right? Another example, which is probably closer to what I mean. So we have a certain theory of knowledge. We have to get to this a lot more bariches, but we, meaning generally people nowadays think of knowledge in a certain way, which is based on a certain nominalistic theory of knowledge, which leads us to think that therefore our knowing about God is what Olam Haba is. It makes no sense. But if you have a totally different theory of knowledge, we think that knowledge means description.
Knowledge by description, not knowledge.
And then to them, knowledge means connecting, acquiring the form of the thing, right? Who?
Richard Russell said that it's the chiluk in what you say in German. Canon invest in two types of knowledge. Not
you could
knowing,
think maybe no, but it's even more that but even more than that. He's totally on the side of descriptionist, of course, but even more than that. For example, and in other words, now what happened? If you have an old-fashioned view, where there's old-fashioned and like Pshita shall make a view. I don't know exactly what it would mean, but let's say, then you actually know God. You actually, if you have a Rambam view, then you actually even have better and more sophisticated and more complete and more exact philosophically and everything knowledge of God.
So it's by description.
Right?
I mean, is that really
No, it's not by description. No. Now you have to get to this. The Rambam doesn't think that word he's describing God. He thinks he's knowing God for real. Now, what's
the others? It's knowledge because it's knowledge by acquaintance, right?
No, yeah, but I don't mean this. See, that's not what I mean. It's maybe a digma of what I mean. What I mean is, you have to remember the better words for it. What I mean is that to them, it literally means God coming into your mind until we don't really have a difference between the two things. Okay. Now, for example, that's not just an example. I can't them right now to talk about it more better. But what I'm saying is that we're left with this. Okay, so obviously there's no Olam Haba where you get a lot of candies and honey and chvaizvos. Of course, it's rachnias, whatever that's supposed to mean. But we also have no idea what rachnias means. The Rambam totally knew what rachnias means. So when he said it, whatever he used, I don't know if he used the word rachnias, but whatever word he used, he totally knows what it is. And he actually has some taste for it, Olam Haba, right? He knows what knowing God means. He might say, since we're in a body, and this is another example for the whole thing, what I'm saying. For example, to the Rambam, since we're in a body, we can't always be only knowing, right? And this doesn't only mean in time. It means that we sort of get disconnected from our actual essence, which is the knowledge that we have, with the knowledge of God. And since we have to go to the bathroom, and obviously when you're going to the bathroom, you're not only that you're not bedvaikis, because maybe that might be surmountable. You might be able to be bedvaikis when you go to the bathroom. But going to the bathroom is not a godly thing to him. That's something that the body does. It's not something that the mind does. It's not something that the neshama does. And sometimes he's by his neshama. He's when he davens, or when he has time to misblow it for 2 weeks and do philosophy, right? And he really enjoys that, right? He talks about Tanag and Simcha. That's really what he really sees that as the goal of life. That's the peak experience that a person can have. The most happy thing that it literally, the Aristotelian ethics is basically based on Simcha. It's based on what human happiness is, right? What the goal of human happiness is, and that's knowing God. And he has it sometimes on Shabbos, Chais, whenever. And then he imagines, and it totally makes sense to him, that Olam Haba means not having to ever go to the bathroom, and therefore you're totally blissed in the bliss of knowing God. This is the theory of Olam Haba that the ancients, that the medievals have. And this makes total sense. And from this comes out a certain zilzal in the gift, for example, right? It says, okay, therefore and to him, and people don't realize that people ask the kasha, the Rambam seems to say that precious is useless, and then he seems to be big purish, or someone says, so Sabish has to steer of a rumor, Rambam talks so much about precious, and the Rambam seems to be against precious, and Shemaya Brokem, and so on, and they don't have what's going on bichlal. Because the Rambam is against precious is in the sense that he doesn't think that it's conductive to knowledge to hurt your body. It doesn't help. That's a silly thing. But of course, he totally sees the body as something that only bothers him most of the time. Because he believes that, again, because he doesn't have a theory, he's a real dualist, right? At least a real dualist, something like that, right? He really thinks that the neshama is, the mind doesn't exist in the body. The mind doesn't use the brain. The mind is a thing by itself. And of course, he has that, right? He has knowledge, he has thought. But thought doesn't exist in a vessel. Thought doesn't exist doesn't work through the body at all, right? And of course, in that sense, he literally thinks that all the things of the body are just bothering, not letting him think. And of course, Olam Haba is totally disembodied, totally the thought existing by itself, and it makes total sense, and it's amazing. And what happens? We disagree with every step of this metaphysics for no reason, just because we decided that some guy said that it's not true. Let's say that's my working theory, because we'll get to more details of this. right? But if you ask like one of these Miki Abram kind of people, I never saw him disprove any of these things. He just assumes that, weiß nicht. And
I think he is a little more open to. Not to.
no, you see, he's very open to all the problems. There is a God. I have no idea what about it, so I have no chanish kana know of him. See, he has a minute without tanik, without simcha. See, there is a God, and therefore it makes sense that he gave the Torah and told you to do this. That's all I know about it. In other words, you have the yira without the have, not the yira, only not even yira. You just have the obligation without any content. That's totally not a kind of very. Of course, it's very hard to sell that, right? Very few people become balachiva for this theory.
I saw the same criticism they have on medals. Mamish.
Yes, you could have. I think that probably.
It's devoid from any
yeah. So, but you see what's going on.
He calls it Goshem and Mitzvah.
Right, no, but okay, let's. Ich weiß. Okay, we have to talk about that's another. Right, but I would say, so I would say something even more serious than that. In other words, I'm not worried about Mendelssohn saying we don't. I think that's actually an example. I do think that it's an example, but let me finish what I'm saying. I think in the theory it's true. In other words, Mendelssohn, not only Mendelssohn, because the whole it's count really. That's fault is in a very broad sense, and also William of Ockham. I'll get to that.
Who?
This Ockham guy that you were mentioning, his razor, he's shildig for this. Now, what was I saying? You can't exactly. You cannot. It's very sad. And what I think is like this. Even if you tell me that, they go in ugefregt these metaphysics. In other words, that's what they call the middle part, right? There's a top part, which is the concept, the middle bottom part, which is the devotion, and the middle part, which is the metaphysics, which is the science, the way of thinking, the way of understanding the world. And I'm thinking, and there's different ways of thinking, but as a first step, I say, and what I'm trying to think is that it's a bad idea to stay with all the shlila that the Rishonim told us and not have any of their chiyuv. It's just a very bad idea. End up with a very sad version of Judaism. A sad version of life, forget about Judaism, right? End up with a very sad life. Because we're not allowed to talk about God. And it's not about you're not allowed to, right? Most people like that will tell you it's nonsense, it's shtissim. It's dumb, right? It's dumb to imagine God in any way. Including in the way that the Rambam imagined him. Well, not imagined him, that's another thought him. Because we know even less than the Rambam thought we know. Right? But also don't have, any mythical descriptions. And of course, therefore, people who don't have any, all the descriptions that we used to have, which the Rambam killed for us, right? And of course, because we think that those are dumb, even more dumb. So we end up with the most poor conception. And of course, all that we're left to do is to fight with Richard Dawkins. Okay, sad. Very boring life mission. So what I would say is something like this. Let's think about Kabbalah separately, but right now I don't think that Kabbalah changes anything. You could say, by the way, everything that I'm saying is true for Kabbalah also. The difference in Kabbalah and philosophy is only in Prutim, of what to know. Kabbalah thinks that there is a way to know God, 100%, right? They don't, of course.
So yeah.
That's right, so it's not relevant. The difference in philosophy, in the Rambam and Kabbalah is not interesting here.
No, I just think that today Kabbalah is very popular.
I don't think that Kabbalah is popular. I think that some weird parish that uses words that Kabbalah also use their popular. Okay, I'm not sure that Kabbalah is popular in the sense that I think of Kabbalah, or in the sense of the Rishonim thought of Kabbalah. Maybe in the sense that some. But let's leave this because it's makes it too exciting. I have to stay boring. Okay. But Kabbalah, one second. Kabbalah is. What happens? I'll tell you what I think about this in this context. What the Kabbalim are doing is basically what I'm doing. What the people now, the modern Kabbalahs, not all of them, but some of them. What I was saying, what I would think. Let's say what I think. What I think is something like this. If you want to say that these Achronim, these critical Descartes, Kant, whatever, all these Chevre were right about Aristotelian way of thinking being wrong, at least be sod, right? That it's not possible to actually know anything in the world. Get to it very deeply. Then you probably might as well be an atheist. In other words, would probably have a better life as an atheist, a life of the mind, or at least be a scientist. Just do science, do something that somewhat could be known. We shouldn't be doing theology at all. Or actually, this is basically what these people are saying. They're just very stuck with halacha. I don't know why. It really doesn't make sense. It's very disconnected. You definitely don't have a way to do avoid Hashem. All right. Now, therefore, I say as since we're stuck somehow with this idea that there is a God, so we might as well figure out what the idea is. Now, of course, you could say that there's two ways of going. There's three ways of doing this, basically, right? One way is to say, okay, therefore, since the Rambam is nonsense, let's just go back to believe in the God of the Bible, which some people tend to do, and I hate them for that. Chas v'shalom. Because they end up with a really childish God. I'm sorry, that God technically doesn't exist. Now, come on. The Rambam was right about that. Come on. They also basically know that they just pretend to not know. Come on. It's at least not sophisticated. I believe that God should be sophisticated. It should be something. It should be hard to understand. It can't be that God is really easy to understand. Why? I mean, we can get into this, but I don't want that. Why? We could try to justify it, but you end up with a very silly version. I'm pretty sure that the Chumash itself didn't mean that silly version. Maybe kids are supposed to understand like this, but I believe the Rambam and so much, and this idea that the world is not as dumb. It's not okay, Pshita Shamikra or something like that. Therefore, there's nothing deeper that exists. That's the Meshiga. Obviously, the world is much more complicated than the Bible, than the Pshita Shamikra lets on. And the Pshita Shamikra has reasons for it being like that. I'm not saying that it's a bad method to read something, but it's just very dumb to like, okay, there's just a God, and come on. You end up with being a real stupid, a bigger Megashim than the Rambam ever thought of, basically. And there's some criticism of these modern theists that they are like this. These people like Miki Abraham, and they're Christians that he's actually a Talmud of, literally. This guy that I'm reading, this guy named Edward Fesser, one of his big hacks is that planting and intentional design, all of them are big Magshima. And what's his name, Craig, whatever, all these chavra, his theory is that they all have a very Megishim God, because their God is basically a person that's the biggest person, because they don't believe in all the concepts that make Narak Shema work. Basically, for something like this, I have to read a little more. That's basically one of his arguments, and it's a question if it's true for those people. I don't think the Mamish literally Magshim probably exaggerates about that, but they at least have nothing to tell you about God. Besides that, he exists, which is not what the Rambam would say. Even though he would say the same words, it doesn't mean anything like that. And not what any old people would say. And in this sense, but let's go back to the Pshita Shamikra people are definitely doing something as dumb as that. They basically believe in God as a person. Like, come on. Or God as like the word, like the Bible critics describe the old God, the word, the guy that makes wars for us. Like, come on, that's really who you want to worship? This is better than the Rambam's God? Come on, seriously? For them, this is why we came back to Yisrael, these theories, so we should be able to go back to worshipping Baal, basically. Just call him Avaya. Seriously. Makes rain. That's, of course God makes rain. I'm not saying that that's what it's for.
No, I just think
it's very dumb.
The is because our science is not like that.
I will talk about of course. We'll get to this. Nachamol. Science is also based. Yes. I'm Science is basically
the same time as like also with people's Yiddishkeit. I'm supposed to keep Yiddishkeit like. I say this doesn't make sense. I say this statement. This is so you want to say I should keep a stupid Yiddishkeit. I don't want to keep a
exactly. So I'm saying is that at least. So basically, what I'm saying.
Everything else you're smart.
So my Tana.
If you be stupid. If you be 2,000 years ago, if you be stupid,
then
so you're stupid, you're not stupid, right? So what are you talking about?
Right.
So you just should be stupid. I mean,
something similar to that, right? So I don't think it's as dumb as that, but my argument would be, so that's one solution. Okay, the second solution is the Kabbalah, so-called Kabbalah solution. The Kabbalah solution is basically a trick where they basically believe in the Aristotelian worldview, and they call it with different names, more or less. Learn Tanya. What's Tanya? There's basically Tanya is basically Thomas Aquinas. There's two souls. There's whatever. Okay. These things make even less sense in the modern worldview. Why is that acceptable?
No, but forget they need to say more positive things about God.
Of course. But they're not taking out of problems. They're not taking care of any problems. They're not actually taking care of any problems. All they're doing is if they're taking care of the problems, then there's solutions that people have thought about in philosophy too. There's very little innovative philosophy in any of these things, and they definitely don't answer. So basically, the reality is, for the most part, that this is for the most part, not entirely, for the most part, the kind of people that say Chassidus, Kabbalah, whatever these things are the solution, are just people that are just very twimistic. They basically believe that it's for Yisraelis. Come on. And they say, it's a Kabbalah. It doesn't mean literally, it means less. Okay, and how does that help you? it only helps you in a very limited sense, and mostly by denying by taka living in basically in the medieval world,
Right.
basically more or less.
That's
So why?
it's just
No.
You just have people doing that. You don't have people doing Rambam.
Exactly. So why can't we do the same thing with the Rambam? We could.
We could. Okay.
I think that the Mekabulim have a better PR group.
I think basically.
There are some.
I think he's Danziger. That's
Oh, Danziger's that.
I think they're Rambamists.
Yeah.
The only ones left over.
Some people are like some Rambamists. No, actually not. See, but actually, see, this is I could be the Chsidim Pekasim, but
no, they're Pekasim because they don't believe in Rambam.
I understand. Okay, so the Rambamists that exist, actually, for the most part, the Rambamists that exist. 1 minute. But it's not. That's I understand, but I think that's wrong. In other words, most Rambamists, so there's very few Rambamists that are actually real Rambamists, because they don't have as much of Mena Pshita as the Mekabulim have in their teachers. In the Rambam, because the Rambam, of course, doesn't teach a Mena Pshita, doesn't have that rhetoric at all. So most Rambamists, like people that you're referencing and so on, I don't know personally what they think, but most Rambamists that I know actually end up doing what I said earlier. They end up accepting all the chemras of the Rambam without any of his killas, because they don't actually enjoy thinking of their God like the Rambam taught. And actually, the reason they hate Chassidus is, and so on, is more about this than some doctrine that they disagree with. Because I'm not sure that in the Rambam's version it's really epicarsis, any of these things. It's only when you have I call it the atheistic reading of the Rambam. We could call it the Mendelssohn reading of the Rambam also, because he's very close to this. The Haskula reading of the Rambam, which basically makes the Rambam into a Kantian. We have to get into this whole thing, which basically makes the Rambam into something very close to Kant and all these modern epicarsis in reason. And the Rambam is the furthest thing from that. He totally believes in reason, totally believes in understanding God through reason, and the correct way, of course. And Kabul is very close to that. Maybe they will say they need revelation and so on, but they don't say anything very far from that. They say that there's content to be known. And these modern Rambamists basically don't think that way. Because I know very little modern Rambamists that sit down and think about God, the Shuach, Skoid, Matfila, and the Rambam is God. Therefore, all the Rambam is good for them is to hack on other people, which is useless. Again, it's basically like the guy that hacks on dog and they hacked off Chassidim. Or something of What's the point? Did you have a Vira from this? The Rambam said you should have a Vira. Why don't you even think that there's something wrong if you're not doing it, right? I don't think it's something, you see, this also has to do with another thing with Riyadh put on your list to disprove. I'm a little getting confused, I'm flying around. Alright, so Nachli and Naini. Where am I in my math? I have to remember, I'm gonna fly in different directions, I'm not gonna remember where I am. What I was saying is that I had a list of 3 problems. The middle problem was that the concepts are not wrong. And what I was saying is that to solve this problem, there seems to be 3 different ways, right? One is to say that we're going to believe in the old God, basically in the Old Testament. You know what that Pekarsim called the old God, right? Because no Elachid believes that was really what we thought, right? Every Elachid knows that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't believe in the Megishim Degi God, besides for some Shitshon Mikraniks that are smarter than everyone, and they have a Megishim Degi God, like a Victim Ele, whatever. Basically, everybody believes in God. That's a Megishim, 100%. Now, okay, why am I saying this? Now, but yeah. Now, that's one way. Another way is to be a Mekibel, which, to my mind, most of what people that are Mekibelim are just unaware Aristotelians or Platonists, whatever, which is very close. And the guy did this is no different. Again, the Chalik is in Prutim. It's the Chomer and Tzira and Chomer. Besides, but the word is they do believe in the possibility of knowledge. They believe in the possibility of knowledge being a kind of real dvaikus. They believe in God being knowable. They believe in all these things. The Mekabulim, not the Lubavitches. Lubavitches are much more Rambamist like that. So that's a second option. The third option, which is the Rambamist option, is very close to the atheist. That's the people that I'm being shown here. The modern day Rambamists, which end up with only the Chimras of like Lebovich. They end up with a very, I call this the Haskula reading of Rambam, because it's more or less the Haskula reading of Rambam. And I think this is actually the reading which, and it might be older than the Haskula, might be already traceable to the Spanish Haskula, but the Haskula reading of Rambam ended up where Mendelssohn ends up, which is a Yiddishkeit, which like Lebovich ends up, which is where a lot of Chareidim end up in reality, at least Litvaks. Where
about the difference in Litvak. Litvak's at least this is their life.
Okay.
Because they're like,
Ich verstehe.
Mendelssohn
That's
that
true.
wasn't his life.
I understand. Okay, that's social questions. I understand. I agree. I'm not worried about the social. I agree. I bechlal hold that. I bechlal agree with that. But that's not. That's true. No, I agree. I agree that if you're that I bechlal think that it's a shame to be a minimalistic Jew, like a modern Jew. Like the whole fun of being a Yid is to have kigel. Like if you go only have the again. Yiddishkeit has bad parts, bad, whatever. The hard parts, and let's call it good parts for the, hard parts and easy parts, or useful. I don't know how I'm finding a better word, right? Like midas akvira, midas achesed, right? There's the helpful things, and there's the things that you do because miz, right? Now, basically, modern Jews are basically the people choosing only the hard part, and of course they talk so much about the Akaida. Why don't you come together to eat kigel more? Why don't you put on a shtramel? Shtramel is nicer than a modern rekel. I don't understand all the people that when they become modern, they adopt the worst parts of modernity. In other words, the poorest parts, right? Like you look, and this is true in the whole world, right? The Catholics, like, well, it's not. They're going to be modern. You know what we're going to do? We're going to stop singing all the cool songs that we had. And we're going to sing some dumb Britney Spears. I don't know what we're going to sing in Mass. But it's whatever. That's exaggeration, but that's basically what happens. And we're going to stop singing. You know what happens even in closer to our circles, right? We're going to be mischatshim. We're going to stop singing. We're not going to sing any Rapshitza songs. We're going to sing some Kalbach nursery tunes, okay? Like, come on. This is mamish lachze vayr is nicht burem. Whatever, nothing against Kalbach, but his tunes are basically dumb tunes, for the most part. They're not sophisticated. They don't have any tiefkeit in it. It's good. Everyone understands that kids and adults on the same level. Why don't you think some old Nissach is even very better than this? And the same thing happens, the Pope decided he's gonna be modern, so he's gonna stop wearing a crown. What's the point? Wow, it's a beautiful crown. Why don't you wear it? The only people still wearing the crown is the Greek Orthodox, the Russian guy. He wears such a beautiful. Look at YouTube. It's beauty.
It's so because they're bored of them. The more Heimish, the more Nissach there is, the less songs.
Yeah.
So they can't.
Because they don't know the Nissach. Of course. Nissach is not more sophisticated than songs. Of course. Of course. I saw on this, but this is total random rant. See, no shakas. What I saw on some random guy was mamish a chiddush to him that there's, that there's a Nissach a weekday davening. Did you know? Let's not go to Sat Mashil. You'll see it every day. The Litvaks don't either know it, by the way.
They have
their own.
Very stark.
The Satmar is much better. They don't do Psikha Zimra at all and so on.
I don't know, but from Baruch is very stark in this.
Yeah. They like it in this.
I mean, it's whatever.
You don't have to like it beside it, but it exists. It exists.
Sure.
And if you know in Lubavitch, nobody knows about it. And all know, because again, they have, okay, whatever, so on. A lot of modern people, they just dumped all the good part. It's so funny. Like the first thing that you become modern, steht auf der Weiß. Kannst du sagen, pink der Geschmack der Sache ist da weggenommen? The only good thing, like, the one thing that ancient people do better than modern people is beauty, is aesthetics. I mean, everyone agrees. Almost everyone agrees. All normal people, at least. And modern art people don't agree because they think that some black box on a wall is beautiful. But normal mensen think that it's nice. I mean, okay, it's kitschy. We can make some side. And by the way, people don't realize this. All the Rebbe stopped wearing white and colorful badges like the bells. They just became modern. It's only about that. They realized that it's not. It's nicht gangbar in the hand der Welt to wear like a colorful badge. And you could see, the more old-fashioned someone is, the more colorful clothing he has. And I'm looking, well, it's not. We really bought into this shiguan that black is beautiful. Are you crazy? People has theories about it. We wear black because they're going more black. There's no other reason. It's not because it's not traditional. Traditional is colorful. All we used to have be much more colorful. Now, yeah, not only Islam, in European Yidden before used to wear colorful clothing. Everything has been more colorful. No, what happened? Whatever. No, people used to wear eklich with different colors pants. If you had money, if you're rich. Okay, the Rebbe's didn't invent the colorful badges. They took whatever the local gvir had. Okay, yeah, but something similar happens to theology. See, and we got the Occam's razor and all kinds of things like that, which makes everything poorer. Again, you want to be a guy, guys, a guy, and at least a guy has some, my friend bought a house here in Lakewood, a goyish house. It's a whole different house, verstehst? The bathroom is bigger than the dining room. It's andere Suge von Tane Goyle Maser, you understand? Both are Tane Goyle Maser, right? Just different Suge. Da Schwitz mit zwei Toilet. And he's like, so, and she showed me that, you know, I eat that zwei sinks in the kitchen, that zwei sinks in the bathroom. She says, in the vamp, can I stay in the friends? I don't know why they have two sinks, probably for that, right? I'm like, this whole different level of Elam Haza. It's not different, both are Elam Haza, yeah? So if you're a guy, at least you have a bathroom, shine, with a bath and everything. But I eat, at least that's the mikveh. No, let's not go into the mikveh, that's old-fashioned. But and not have that either, so it slaps them it. And the same thing happens in theology. You understand? You could be a mikveh. That's why Kabbalah is popular. It's really true because what Kabbalah socially, not talking theologically, it offers a rich description of the religious life, of the internal life, of the life of God. At least there's something to do, something to be machav, there's something to think. Epis guide for. And what I'm saying is, I definitely the problem with Kabbalah, in my view, and the problem, I love Kabbalah, but the chesurin of it is that they don't really define their concepts, and you don't realize that you're basically doing you have this same amount of dated concepts, right? Of what people would call unscientific concepts, and they just because they pretended to be men, whatever, we don't realize people don't have, but it's not better in that sense. In any case. That would be a way also, but I think that's a lot more work to figure out what they're actually even saying. But Kalpunim, I would say, so that would be a first step to say that, okay, so why don't let's be Tmimis Diga Rambam Eden, not like the Ovgekret, like Maskilim Rambam Eden, right? Let's be the real Rambam Eden. Not real, I don't say we should be, at least let's have an appreciation of that. I think it's worth putting in a few months to try to figure out what that is. Maybe we'll decide it's not, but it's at least something. Now, what do we know? So now we have the real question. And this is where probably there's a lot of work to do and try to think. I don't have a very good, clear picture. I just have a list of things that we have to think of. So now, what could we do about it, right? So there's a few different strategies what to do with this. What to do with the problem. For example, we'll try to learn the Rambam's proof for the existence of God in the beginning of Chalik Bayis, right? And it's based on the Galgalim and all these things, and right away people start rolling their eyes, which Galgalim and so on, right? So now there's the teretz is basically, and at least this person works with this mahalach. I'm not sure yet if I like it, but the teretz would be to say, Reb Fesser, he says that Aristotle was mostly wrong about science and mostly right about metaphysics. Science, I know a sense without Aristotelian metaphysics. This is Miki Abram would like this, but he doesn't actually go even close to as far. But it's a sort of separation of concerns. Now, it's an interesting thing to think about, right? For example, it's obviously true, but no, I want to be madgish not to do this too much. That's what my problem is, because he's doing something like this. Right? He says, well, the first cause argument doesn't need all the elaboration that the Rambam had. We can just say it in a very simple way. Forget Galgalim and Koyach and Poel and Sida and Chaim or whatever. And you end up, but the problem is you don't end up with the same God. You end up with a very poor version of God, because it's, in the Rambam's version there was a reason to think why God is not a gift, for example, because of the whole way the proof worked. And in his version there isn't. So God might as well be a body. He just says, well, why would he be a body? Something like that. Doesn't ever tell us for that. I think that his person goes a little further than that, and he tries to say, and this is another strategy that we could think of, and he tries to say that actually the details of how the world works are, even according to Aristotle, at least according to Thomas Aquinas, which he uses more, are another level than what he's thinking of in the sense of metaphysics. In other words, and I think Aquinas says this openly, but maybe others also say this. Everyone knew, you see, we have this idea, and this is the very problematic idea, but it's one I don't know enough to have to figure more out about this. This idea that you think, okay, let's not talk about Dali Yesod, because Dali Yesod is physics, it's not metaphysics, right? But metaphysics, for example, which says that the world is made out of three things: Choy, Metzira, and the privation, the Chesurin. I don't remember what he calls it, the Rambam Heder, right? The lack of a sira, basically. Okay. This is an analysis that might be still true. Okay. Of course, you say, what do you mean it's true? The world is made out of atoms. And he says, well, nobody disagreed with that. I mean, Aristotle disagreed with the atoms, but they're not about this. nobody disagrees that there's a lot of levels of things in which the things make sense and can be described.
And it's a description, Chomer and Tzira. I mean, I could say...
No, he wants faket. He says pink faket. Chomer and Tzira is the reality. The atoms are his description. You understand? That's the important thing, because that's how where it helps us. So this is more or less his strategy, and he writes a book about.
He's more or less he's a Platonist.
No, he's Aristotelian, not a Platonist, but he's Aristotelian. See,
Why?
because he thinks that the world is made out of Chomer and Tzira, not like Plato that it's Tzira separate, plus Tzira, whatever. But it's different than Prutim. He's a Platonist in the sense that he thinks that there are real things, and whatever Plato might like. Let's not get into this chilik. The word is that he thinks that physics, for example, doesn't actually explain what things are, because all it does is isolate some part that's trackable in our math systems and so on, and talk about them and describe them, we could say. But we still, the same kasha that Aristotle had, we still had. For example, Aristotle kasha, how is change possible? This is what the whole physics was based on. So this kasha is still shvei. Nobody found a teretz for it. We just decided to talk about other things, and Aristotle didn't have a problem. Happens to be he might have had a theory for those parts also, which was wrong. Okay. In other words, he say, what are things made out of? Could we divide them? He said, well, we could divide them into four things and all this. And it turns out you could divide them a little more. It's all detail. That's not the real thing. That's not what metaphysics are about. His kasha was, okay, now explain me how they change, or what it's actually made out of in the end, how they get to this form, and so on. We have to think of more detail on this, and he claims that for that science doesn't even think of. They just decided not to think about it, but they didn't fake up Aristotle. Let's just ignore him. And therefore, if you want, now of course there's a question: why would you need the Aristotle? What is it helpful for? But it's helpful for his theology for sure. It's helpful for understanding, because it's really okay. But here there's a real question. At least I'm just laying out the plan. This is a plan to think in this sense. And maybe it's actually true. Again, same to change. Maybe it's true that change is a problem by itself. Not only describe me the change, which is what science does. The concept of change is problematic. He explains why there was a problem with the concept of change. And therefore we need to have the teretz, which is the teretz of Chomer and Tzira, basically, or koyach and poel, which in Aristotle work very similarly. And therefore we need God that can start the change. This is the first cause argument in Aristotle's version, not the bare bones version that modern people use, and therefore we could prove everything that we used to prove. That's the basic mahalach that he seems to have, and that's one important thing. The second thing, which he seems to also try to do, and really probably what a lot more work needs to be tried to figure it out, is I'm very interested in the knowledge part of it, but it's true for the science of the ontology part also, which is you see, if I tell you these kind of things, you say it seems useless. And like for example, when you talk about description, you say, okay, like we could describe the world as Chomer and Tzira, but L'mayna of Kemina. Right? Now this presumes a huge thing. And you don't even realize that it's all people use the thing differently, and actually probably people today still think differently when they think informally, when they're not pushed to answer things. And since certain people have convinced us and spent a lot of time to work out how to not think like this, and most people nowadays intuitively think like this, and they don't really defend it. It's like they received opinion. It's like a messiah that we think like this, but maybe it's wrong. And this is basically the question of, we could call nominalism versus realism, right? Which nominalism is basically a position that was more or less invented by a few medieval thinkers, Peter Abelard and William Avaka. And they sort of invented the idea that there are no, there's nothing, in their language, that there are no universals, right? That there's no such a thing as a person, right? We're only people, individual people. There's no thing as a person. And this, if you follow this logic all the way, you end up where we ended up now, which is in a world where it's not really possible to know anything. Oh, now it's working. Oh, but it fell out before? Okay. And we end up with a world where it's not possible to really know anything, only to describe it. Which basically means that a lot of things. But it doesn't seem to be like a very... I mean, of course, again, people have worked a lot to figure out, and then... This is basically probably the most... to my untrained mind, this is probably the most basic assumption that... Again, even people that didn't think any of these concepts seem to naturally nowadays think like this. And therefore they don't have the caches that Aristotle's physics had. Which is basically that they made the great trick that the modern scientists and epistemology pulled on us. Instead of convincing us that they're right and the old-fashioned things are wrong, they just said, those are irrelevant, we're not going to think of their questions anymore. We're just going to describe things. Okay, very nice description, but what is it? And then, basically, to my understanding is that then some people came and they called themselves phenomenologists, right? Husserl. And they said, well, whatever, in between there's Kant, but... And they said that, well, even if I can't, there are not things, things seem like things to me. So let's talk about that. A lot of new religious thought is based on this kind of way of thinking. And to me, that's just like a very long way of saying the essence of things. Maybe. I'm not sure. Basically, it has to do with essentialism, right? Do things b'chlal exist, or are they only descriptions, and what actually exists, we don't know. Right? And the way out of this, for some people, was to say, I don't know what actually exists, I know how things appear to me. And Kant more or less started this way of thinking. And then they say, okay, so maybe that's where we should talk more about how things seem to me. And that's, in a certain sense, a very bad way of thinking, because it basically may make all my mistakes into truths. I mean, come on. Maybe the world is not how it seems to you. Right? Very hard to have arguments if someone says, okay, but you're wrong. That leads to a very funny subjectivism that I don't like. Therefore, maybe it might be just smarter to talk about it in the old-fashioned way, which is there are essences of things. Things really are, and they don't need you to think of them to be like that. They were there before you, and this is not related to how they're not just the way of describing them. It's how they really are, and knowledge really means knowing what things really are, not being able to describe things in useful ways. That would be okay. That would be another very important thing, I think, to figure out. There was a third thing that I wanted to talk. Beside maybe you could. There was an ancient theory for how you could. Maybe you could. I forgot there was one more thing that exactly, maybe. But this is what caused, again, this chilik is really what makes people, and I'm going to stop here, make people really think that proofs of God are useless. Because, okay, I have a way to... No. In the old way of thinking about knowledge, proving something is actually knowing it for real. Because you understand how it is, and that really brought you to God. Or you could talk about it accessing, right? You have the form of God in you. And of course, we get into a problem. Could you actually have that form? Okay, somewhat you could, somewhat you can't. But in another way, it's totally useless, because you only have a representation of God in you. Or a statement of God. It's the difference between knowing statements and knowing things, right? I think this is... there was one more thing I tried to forget what it was that I thought was one of the shirushim of this problem. But these are basically the real questions to figure out. Basically, in the conceptual, scientific, philosophical sense, is it true that, like this person wants to claim, that all of Aristotelian, more or less all, maybe not all, but concepts could be defended with no connection to if there's atoms or not, or so on. And secondly, which is more interesting to me, is what does it mean to actually know things, and maybe this whole story about nominalism and universalism and universals and realism, and then the whole story with Kant's solution to this, maybe, and all the different things that grow out of that. There's another thing which he's very busy with. Okay, guys, stop and do. I'll try to clarify it more next time. These are all things that have to be considered. From this, we have to get to the whole question of
Where'd you pick up this guy? He's a famous guy.
Google. I don't know.
Huh?
Apparently, he's famous among Catholics.
Catholic?
Yeah. He's a großer Catholic. The Pope's nicht gonna is Pope's from Popes, you know, literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks like it was a politic.
Whatever, it was a politic. I'm not interested in this politic because the Pope's is too liberal. Whatever, you don't know.
Oh ja, hij is vreemd, echt een vreemd is het.
It's vreemd. Yeah, probably. But apparently he's a real philosopher and he knows what he's talking about somewhat. The word is that it's possible to dismantle this whole thing that we're so sure about, that, you know, basically that nominalism is true. That's how I would think about it. But basically that we can't really know anything, and everything is just descriptions, and therefore all the questions.
A lot of people believe in universalism.
Not universal, in universals, in real categories. I don't know.
Universals, of course. It's very.
No, some monolithic philosophers probably believe in it.
No, what do you mean? Virtual also believe in universals.
Maybe in some way, ich weiß nicht.
I think it's split.
He talks about it. Someone talks about it. I don't remember.
Survey of all question of philosophy.
No, analytic philosophers believe in a ton of things that are totally useless because they all are so into the forms of things. And that's why nobody reads them. It's only interesting to other philosophers.
Yeah, okay.
There's something wrong with this whole mahalach.
A lot of people believe.
Well, a lot of they also believe in God. And
no, much more than God. No,
probably a little
maybe
more.
Maybe most believe in universals is very, very popular.
I'm not sure, but I feel like it's some. I don't know. I have to look this up.
By philosophy.
Exactly, philosophers and scientists also have a big machlokes about all these things.
Right. Yeah, because scientists.
So the philosophers are right. Always?
Yeah,
I don't know.
No, because they thought about it. They're not in this field.
It's not clear to me. This is what the philosophers say.
You're not gonna see a universal under a microscope. I mean, why
I understand. I'm not sure. It's not clear to me that this is true, but it's at least a thing that makes sense. Yeah. Because so that's my plan, sort of. There's the things that I want to think about. I think if we could get anywhere with them, that would be helpful. Basically, two things that are mostly important, right? Three things. Like, let's try to say some arguments for the existence of God in ways that are actually helpful. And basically, two things. Try to somewhat dismantle, like, figure out what the assumptions that makes everyone think in such nominalist. I'm going to call it nominalist terms. Why? And secondly, try to. I'm just remembering my list. And secondly, to try to. No, what was the second thing? Try to think about knowledge, what the ancient theory of knowledge is, what the Rambam's theory of knowledge is, and how that definitely makes sense. The third thing over here would be to figure out if the entire Aristotelian metaphysics are still true and so on, or might be true, or might be more useful than people think.
Yeah, question how to connect this Taka old to.
Avodas Hashem. Okay. Then Torah Emet. No. So let me tell you. Okay. Wait a second. No. The one thing I'm going to tell about Torah Emet is that's not true. I don't think that. And my impression is that the Rambam is much less worried about Torah Emet than you think he is. And again, this has to do with the school reading of the Rambam, and for two reasons. Number one, because Torah Emet are supposed to be the background. That's number one. In other words, we are very worried about justifying the law because we live in a world without law. Without the law of the Torah, at least. There might be other laws, right? In other words, just like if we would live in a world, or we do live, actually in Lakewood we do live. See, that's why I think Lakewood should have a lot more radical theology than Teaneck. It actually does, in some ways. Because in Teaneck they have to justify the law. And therefore you have to figure out what theology makes sense for that. In Lakewood, or just like in the United States, someone could be you could be whatever kind of philosopher you want, right? You could come up with every theory of God or any theory of... And then someone asks, okay, therefore why do you have to stop at a traffic light? And you can look at you like, huh? What? What? Shaykhist. Of course you have to stop at a traffic light. Why you should whatever. Maybe you don't, maybe it's less important. Whatever, we can get into why do I even have to give an account of that? It's totally no shaykhist. Of course societies have laws. Like, come on. Everyone understands that. There's legal theorists that dedicate their life to figuring out what our laws and where they come from and should we follow them and what should they be. Besides that, that's not the job of the philosopher, of the theologian. My job is to describe God. My job is to make you understand God. Why is it even important? Why does every understanding of God have to lead to laws? Oh, because there's a Torah that says that. But the Torah is just the law of the land. Of course, there's reasons because the Torah claims to be the law from God. That's a random. I think that the need to connect it is a very modern problem. Not modern. It's a problem from people that don't actually live, that need to have the need to justify the law. I don't think that law needs to be justified from theology so much. I think that this is a very modern problem. I think that I'm very happy. And again, the Rambam basically says something like this, right? The Rambam has no problem with saying that most of the Torah, and people are not happy with this because they're confused about this. No! I'm going to get to Kachrutz in a second. No! Forget about God. Every society needs laws. Okay? Now, God was good enough to give us some for ours beside that. Forget about the Torah Nashmaim part. Right? Because we're thinking about in the level of justifying things by natural reason, by cycle. Why do we need to talk about does my theory of God entail laws? Laws are needed with or without a God. We need laws. Yes, we need shatnez. We'll think about why, but assuming that we do, okay? You have to keep on. We have to keep on getting stuck on this. You need shatnez, yes. Why? The Rambam thinks that basically all mitzvahs have a need shatnez also. If we don't know it, so we forgot. It used to have a reason and we forgot it. That's a theory. It's a natural. It's basically so. This is why. Forget about again. You're asking about details of details. Why a certain halacha? Law has its own. That's a limit. A halacha. There's a whole limit. Why? How did we get the shatters and all these halachas? But why does the aleph? I'm trying to get. This is what I could have gotten a whole half hour drush about this. The Rambam, this problem of reconciling his theology with the Torah's theology, and like you're saying with the halacha, is a lot of much secondary importance than what we think. Because to him, this is extremely exciting by itself. Most people, when you learn Rambam, including in this table, we keep on worrying, okay, is the Rambam changing the Torah very radically? Does he this? Does he shtim? Does he not shtim? But that's a secondary question. To him, this is obviously the truth. And it's a way of living, and it's the reason you exist. It's the reason for life. It's the goal of a human being. It's the ultimate happiness. It's the ultimate pleasure. This is what it is. And of course, this is what the Torah is for also. Now you ask me, why does the Torah have more things? Okay, we could deal with that separately. It's totally not related. He's not here because he's not an apologist, he's not here to justify the Torah. He doesn't feel the need so much. He doesn't even think there's a need to justify the existence of laws. I mean, he does justify it by way of extremely natural reasons. Siyas Shevoilam needs laws, and no society doesn't have laws. I mean, civilized societies. And of course, this is part of the Torah, but it's not the main. When we talk, theology is not about this. Theology is not about justifying the law. Theology is about justifying the knowledge of God, about getting you to the knowledge of God. In modern times, and especially for some, there's more to be spoken about this. For different reasons, people think that, especially like I said, especially in modern people that live in the modern world, where the law of the halacha is not in the background for them. It continuously needs justification. Anything that needs justification is a really of tzuris. Very basic, right? The real thing, is how they say, the people that really have power are the ones that don't talk about it. They don't have to say that they have power, right? Once the Rebbe has to give drushas about it means that the Olam stop believing in him, right? Once you have to give drushas about why to follow the halacha, you lost halacha. And the fact is that in Lakewood, nobody gives drushas why you have to follow halacha. And Tinek, they do. Because in Lakewood, this is the background. What's the question? Why? You don't need a better reason for that. Only the ideologues think they need a better reason for that. You don't need. I'm perfectly happy with the fact that you need to put on tefillin as there's a need for social. We could give all these like naturalistic explanations. We need social cohesion, so we should all come and shield a few times a day and put on. What's wrong with that? That's perfectly enough. It doesn't have to be in the forefront of my theology. My theology is about how we get to God. If you want a theology that's more connected to mitzvahs, how do mitzvahs get you to God? Okay, but that's going the other way, right? It's not how mitzvahs come to God; it's how mitzvahs get you to God. You see, that's really what Chassidus basically reads mitzvahs as, right? But then it's much less worried about how does this mitzvah. It's not. This whole dag is much less. That's number one. And number two, which is more important, and different than what we say kachrutu, is that when you have an understanding of God. Now, any mitzvahs that are related to this, there's of course the Catholics have a much more developed theory of this because they skipped out all the mitzvahs that didn't make sense to them, so they had an easier time. But I don't think that the Rambam's the Jewish rationalistic theory of halacha is very different. Of mitzvahs is very different. What they would say is like this: that the nature of God and the nature of the world that He created entails a certain what the Catholics call natural natural law, natural mitzvahs, basically natural law. There's a correct way, and this comes from Aristotle. There's a correct way for humans to act in accord with their end, with what it means to be a human. In other words, there are certain natural laws, and they come out of the structure of the world and structure of God ultimately. And now, are all mitzvahs natural law? Maybe not. I mean, the Christians definitely think some of them are not. Some of them have particularistic reasons, and therefore they say they're not generally applicable. A guy doesn't have to do it. I think we basically agree with them on this. You understand? Because that's the theory, right? Yidden have certain mitzvahs which have a star. What's wrong with this? You see, we do Pesach because historically, contingently, particularistically, our Zaydas went to Mitzrayim, and therefore to celebrate this, there's a general cloud that says everyone should celebrate what their Zaydas did, and our Zaydas happen to have gone to Mitzrayim, so we eat matzah and Pesach. Why are you not happy with this pshat? It's actually the true pshat. It says in the Chumash, this pshat. I don't even have to be some rationalist to make it up. It's not universally true. The guy has no reason to do it. No, it's not the only way to get to God. It's not even a way to get to God at all. Maybe it is in some sense. Maybe there's a way to do it that way. But it's not about that. It's a very particular. It's not a natural law. But there are natural laws, which are the more important mitzvahs, right? Mitzvah sichliyas, or at least the mitzvahs that have to do with actual yamina itself, or the mitzvahs that have to do with natural morals and so on, which directly come out of the way of what God is, since God is good, so we have to be good in order to understand the different ways of explaining this, but directly comes out, and therefore you actually have a much better way, a much more a much more coherent, a much more fighting, less schizophrenic connection of God with His laws, of God with natural law, and because you have a thick understanding of God, I would call it, you have a real understanding of God, which it makes sense for a God that is like this to have laws that are like this. And the version that we end up with most modern thinkers end up with, for the most part, is very poor, and therefore they end up with what's called a voluntaristic theory of morality even, and of God, right? You end up with a God that nothing can be said of properly, but we're going to randomly decide that we could talk about things that He randomly, arbitrarily decided, sort of, which are the mitzvahs, and then mitzvahs become some sort of crazy thing that have no actual inherent meaning, and this is somewhat matches very well with the nominalistic worldview where nothing has any real meaning. So of course mitzvahs don't either have a real meaning because we can't know anything, so why should we be able to know mitzvahs? That's where Leibovich and people like him end up, more or less, and not only him. Again, big chunk of Litvaks are somewhere close to this, and theologically, that's what happens. That's the same. That's why I'm actually more interested in the first thing I said now. The Rambam is much less worried about making the mitzvahs work than we seem to be sometimes, and the reason is, like I said, it's not important. And for some reason, people are very not happy with this because they the whole time feel the need to justify putting on tefillin in terms of theology, and I don't know why. Why do we have to do that? It seems to be very weak. Like if we know we eat Pesach, so we should remember that we're not in Mitzrayim. Why is that a problem? Why do we have to put in all kinds of levels of meaning into this? I know why, but okay.
Okay. Right, go ahead.
Okay, that's my